Welcome to our Montana. I'm Mike Penfold. It's a nice brisk morning today, far different than July and August when wagon trains came through this area on the Bozeman Trail. By the time the travelers on the Bozeman Trail got here, they'd seen quite a few things. They had come through Wyoming, come to places where there was hardly any water for their cattle and their horses. Actually, some of the cattle died. They had a hard time crossing the Bighorn River, and once they got across, they found several dead men who'd been killed by Indians, probably miners who were heading for the gold fields in Virginia City. They got to Pryor Creek, they camped over there. Actually, they caught quite a few fish in Pryor Creek. Each one of the wagon trains would elect their captain. They called him the captain. Generally, it was the chap who organized the train. One train, the captain's name was Hurlbut, and they camped over on Pryor Creek. One of the wagons had to be fixed. They worked on it. I think they had about 64 wagons, and then they came down through the South Hills. They said the South Hills was the roughest country they had been through since they left their homes in the Midwest. Then they hit the Yellowstone River just a little bit above where I am and came down here very close to Blue Creek. Probably they were camping in this field in front of me here. They had an incident here. The dogs, you know, the travelers in those days brought their dogs along too. Anyway, when they got in here, the dogs spooked the cattle. And when they use the term cattle, usually they're talking about the oxen, and the oxen had horns. And in the diaries, they said that the cattle stampeded and knocked some of the horns off the oxen. A couple of the women were darn near killed when the cattle stampeded here. And so the captain, Hurlbut, called all the people together, maybe in this field right here, and he said, okay, we're going to have to shoot all the dogs. No more dogs are going on my wagon train. Well, the immigrants then were very much like we would be today. You're not shooting my dog. And so here they had to split the wagon train, and one half the wagon train had dogs and the other half did not. And then they went up Blue Creek and on over to Duck Creek and on over to the gold fields. A number of years ago, I had a chance to go to a conference at Fort Phil Kearny, close to Sheridan. There was a couple of people there that I videotaped. One of the guys' name was Joe Marshall. He was a Lakota Sioux Indian. He grew up on the Rosebud Reservation, and his principal language was Lakota Sioux. But he's also a historian and lectured a great deal and written a number of books. I'm going to introduce you to Joe here in a minute or two because I videoed him talking about a piece of history over there. The other guy that I videotaped was a fellow by the name of Sterling Fenn. Fenn's work was as a veterinary in California, but his passion was Western history. And he particularly focused on the history around Fort Phil Kearny and the Bozeman Trail. Actually, I'm going to do two programs on this. The first program is going to be Fenn and Joe Marshall talking about the preamble to what is now known as the Fetterman fight. The Fetterman fight took place in 1866. It's notary because everybody who was in the battle got wiped out by a very careful, orchestrated ambush by the Sioux. The second program is going to be about the fight itself and what happened and how these guys got trapped.
You'll notice that we are in slightly different uniforms this morning. We do that to help us to illustrate the vast difference in the people and the cultures that were represented here in 1866. We'd like to go back about 130 years to the time when this whole region was a vast buffalo range and the prime hunting grounds of the Lakota people. That range was penetrated and bisected by a wagon road all the way from the Platte River to the Virginia City gold fields in Montana north of here. Nowhere, I think, in this entire area is there a more dramatic and tragic example of the clash of the people that were here at the time than here on this ridge that we're on. So we are standing on what today is called the Fetterman Ridge, but what at that time was simply a segment of the Bozeman Trail. This is the Bozeman Trail that we're literally standing on. We're about 3 miles from the fort, a little over 3 miles. That's Lodge Trail Ridge you've just come across. So here, on a very, very cold December 21st of 1866, Captain Fetterman and his military command of 81 soldiers from the fort was completely destroyed. That happened at the hands of a fairly large force of Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors. The military command consisted of 81 soldiers, led by 3 officers, 2 well-armed civilians, 49 infantrymen, and 27 cavalrymen. There were about 50 of those soldiers who were mounted. All the cavalry, of course, was mounted, the 3 officers, the 2 civilians, leaving about 15 or 18 horses available for mounting some infantry. And those mounted infantry play into our story a little later on. The Indian forces were under the influence, of course, of Lakota Oglala Chief Red Cloud, who was probably not here, but certainly he was here in mind and spirit and influence. The battle was really carried out by the war chiefs and the warriors who were to make war here on these forts and along the trail. Realistically, there were something in the order of 700 to 900 warriors here. It breaks down to something in the order of approximately 700 Lakota warriors, 125 or so Northern Cheyenne, and 50 or 60 Arapaho. This was what we call in frontier history as a decoy fight. These soldiers were decoyed away from the fort. Joe will get into a little bit later, but they were decoyed into a trap that had been literally preset and prearranged and literally pre-rehearsed. This was a tactic that had been used earlier very successfully by the Cheyenne. This fight is really only one of a very small handful of battles in U.S. military history where the entire group was wiped out. You think of the Alamo in 1836, the Grattan fight, which was a small matter, but it was total, in 1854, this fight in 1866, and of course the Fetterman fight in 1876. This monument that we're standing by, was placed here in 1908 and marks really only the final phase of the battle. It was dedicated here in 1908, and Colonel Carrington, who was in command of the fort at the time of the fight, stood here at the dedication and described the location of the soldier remains out here on this very hill and out here on the ridge that we're going to go. He identified the location of Captain Fetterman and Brown, who died in the rocks immediately behind us. Sometime, if you haven't already, each of you should take a moment to read the inscription on the plaque, on the monument. There are a couple of basic errors. We've already mentioned that Red Cloud was almost certainly not here, other than his influence. There were not 4 civilians killed, there were only 2. We've also pointed out that the Northern Cheyenne were also represented, as were the Arapaho. The last line, which says that there were no survivors, is clearly an example of a one-sided viewpoint. And I can assure you that Joe and the warriors that were descendants of the warriors who were here would not particularly agree with that statement. Joe will talk a little bit more in just a minute about the Indian name and their oral history on this battle, but it was known to the Indians as the fight of 100 dead or 100 in the hands, and again Joe will get into that shortly. It was known also as the Fetterman Massacre. I want you all to really appreciate that this was not a massacre. I think we should think of a massacre more in the sense of innocent, unarmed, and unprotected people, civilians in particular. I think the Oklahoma bombing was a massacre, for example. This was not. This was a well-armed force of soldiers who had plenty of weapons and plenty of ammunition, and they simply lost the fight. Joe, you want to?
Sure. In order to begin to understand the other viewpoint, let me put you in a situation and ask you a question. If someone were to come into your home or your community, a more powerful group, and began to take over your home or your community, what would you do? Capitulate without a fight, or resist the best way you know how to protect your family and your community? What would happen if an outside force invaded the United States? We would all do something to defend ourselves, would we not? Obviously. That's a human trait. Very rarely have human beings just laid over and died when there was any kind of imperialistic attempt to take over lives, to take over territory. And this was one example of a group of people, my ancestors, deciding that, hey, we're not going to take this stuff, and organized a resistance to the intrusion of the fort on Buffalo Creek, as we called it, the soldier fort on Buffalo Creek. And it was Red Cloud's influence which primarily shaped the way the resistance took form. And most of the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors had very little respect individually for the soldiers in the fort. From our viewpoint, they were afraid to come out of that fort and enjoy this beautiful country. They came here and put themselves in a walled town and were afraid to literally peek over the side of it in many instances. Their lifestyle was totally different. We didn't understand it. We didn't understand their values any more than they understood ours. All we could see was that they were here against our wishes. They were doing something that was contrary to our lifestyle, that was an intrusion on our lifestyle, that was an encroachment on our normal routine. So, of course, Red Cloud and others did everything they could to resist. Now, Sterling mentioned this battle was a decoy maneuver. It was a maneuver that worked against soldiers before. It worked against other Indians before. It's a classic maneuver that is used by cavalry, and Indians are light cavalry. There had been a couple of failed attempts, which we'll talk about before. The ambush that failed a few days before. But the concept was sound. It was that some young men could not discipline themselves to wait for the right moment. So after one of the two failed attempts, a Cheyenne holy man was consulted, and he was sent out to seek a vision or pray for victory. And he came back saying, I have a few soldiers in the hand. And the war leaders told him, that's not enough. Go back and see what else you can see in your dream. And he went out again and came back, and this time he had more soldiers in his hands, he said. But still was not enough. So they sent him out again. So he rode around in these hills all over. Came back and said, I have 100 soldiers in the hand. And that was enough. That was a sign that there was going to be some kind of victory. And although we were not individually afraid, one-on-one, of the soldiers in the fort, we were not stupid enough to disregard the kind of armament they had available to them. And you consider that 700 or 900 against 80 as a one-sided fight. Obviously it is. But that's one way to ensure victory, is it not? Since we didn't have the kind of firepower that the soldiers in the fort did, there was one way to compensate for that. Superior numbers in the field. And that's what won it. Most of us were armed with very poor muzzle loaders and mostly bows and arrows. But this was known as the Battle of the 100 in the Hand because of that Cheyenne holy man's vision of victory that he predicted. And it's amazing that 80 soldiers came out. And it's not quite 100, but it's still close enough to symbolize his or to manifest his vision. So as we go along, we'll give you more detail. But this was the attitude at the time, that we were resisting encroachment. We weren't out to annihilate all white people. We were simply trying to get rid of intruders in our territory, in our hunting ground. This was our last best stronghold as Red Cloud was seeing it. And we were going to do whatever it took. Fighting men were willing to give their lives to send the intruders back to where they came from. So this was just another symptom. This battle was another symptom of that clash that went back that far.
The question often comes up about the massacre versus the mutilation, and I'd just make the comment that there was a great deal of mutilation that did occur here, but on the part of the warriors, that was rooted in a belief to a great deal that that was a major insult to the enemy and also rendered him useless in his afterlife. That, of course, was not the belief of the white soldiers and civilians who slaughtered the Cheyenne Indians at Sand Creek in 1864, which included old men, women, and children. So the word, again, massacre, really doesn't apply to this fight. In order to appreciate better and understand the events that led up to this particular day, December 21st, 1866, we really need to hit on a couple earlier items. In 1865, at Fort Laramie, a treaty was signed guaranteeing the Indians unmolested hunting rights in the Powder River country, which this is, in exchange for travel on the Bozeman Road. The problem with that treaty, and that it was flawed, that it was not appreciated or agreed to by Red Cloud, who was really the principal chief in this area, or the war chiefs, who were not party to that agreement, and it was really signed and agreed to only by those lesser chiefs who were receiving presents regularly at Fort Laramie and who were willing to sign anything. The following year, 1866, negotiations for an additional treaty were in fact occurring at Fort Laramie. Red Cloud was a participant to those negotiations, but during the midst of those negotiations, Colonel Carrington, with 700 well-armed soldiers, marched into Fort Laramie with the express intent of occupying the Bozeman Trail and building 3 forts. Needless to say, this infuriated Red Cloud and his chiefs, and they walked out of the negotiations. Red Cloud warning that anybody north of the Powder River would be subject to attack. He meant that, and he ultimately carried that out. Once the forts were built in the summer of 1866, there were virtual constant depredations on all 3 of the forts. Fort Reno, 67 miles to the southeast of us here, the headquarters fort here at Phil Kearny, and Fort C.F. Smith, 91 miles to the northwest. But principally, this post was under constant siege. That resulted in great danger to any courier, any wood trains, any activity whatsoever, civilian or military, outside of the fort. As a result of Colonel Carrington's reports to the department commander about these raids, he was ordered on November 25th to be more aggressive and to be more punitive and to carry out counterstrikes. That resulted in what amounted to a regular practice of Captain Brown and Captain Fetterman and Colonel Carrington himself taking out parties to relieve these beleaguered people outside of the fort. There were earlier events that we'll cover a little bit later on that had led up to this, but this was a pattern that had developed, and it occurred to the Indians that there was constant activity outside of the fort, and this was a mechanism they could use to draw the soldiers out. Another major factor is the relatively recent alliance between the Northern Cheyenne and the Arapaho people. The Lakota up here on the Tongue River, about 15 or so miles, visited the Northern Cheyenne camps and harangued the Cheyennes, who had originally been either neutral or at least semi-friendly, and he had even on some occasions visited the post and done some trading. But the Lakota reminded the Cheyenne of the disaster at Sand Creek and easily allied the Cheyenne. The Arapaho, who had been attacked by General Connor up on the Tongue River in 1865, friendly or peaceful village had been attacked and destroyed and a lot of people killed. They were also willing to join the Lakota. So here in this country, in the late portion of 1866, you have a very determined coalition or confederation of Plains Indians who are determined in whatever manner possible to destroy the forts and close the trail if possible, which was really Red Cloud's goal. Do you want to talk about the councils of war up on the top?
Throughout this time, during the whole era of the Bozeman Trail, starting back in the early 60s, Red Cloud was probably the first that realized the eventual impact if something wasn't done to alter the flow of traffic on the trail. Not so much the traffic as well as the attitudes that came with it, and the consequences of white people moving with impunity through Lakota territory. So early on, all up and down the tongue in this area, Red Cloud and others, some of the older, more influential leaders, gathered the warriors, the younger leaders and the warriors together, and talked to them quite consistently about what to do and how to deal with this problem. There being kind of a generation gap where the younger warriors were the more action-oriented kind of people. The older warriors were the ones who were more deliberate in their thinking and tended to be more tacticians than some of the younger men. Red Cloud and the others had to, in a sense, make sure that the approach to dealing with the encroachment was done in such a way that it could be effective, and so hence there were a lot of war councils or war up and down the Tongue River. Strangely enough, some of the old men leaders did not agree with Red Cloud, not in the sense that this was a problem that shouldn't be dealt with, but in how to do it. But Red Cloud, it was at that time at the apex of his career, at the apex of his influence among the Lakota. So he was able to influence a lot of the older people and older men, and finally convince the younger warriors that there had to be a way to deal with this problem, and that possibly he was one of the first ones to alter the kinds of ways in which we carried out combat against the whites. Before in intertribal warfare, it was considered far more honorable to touch a live enemy in battle. It was considered far more honorable to demonstrate courage in battle. But this was not a tactic that worked with whites. What whites understood was being killed. The war of outright attrition was all that the white people understood, body count. And this was one of the things that Red Cloud pointed out earlier, and this was the kind of thinking that young warriors like Crazy Horse picked up on, and decided that in order to deal with the whites, we had to alter the way that we fought them. Not our battle tactics. A lot of people think that we altered our battle tactics. We did not. We still fought the same way. The end result was what we changed. And we went for body count rather than counting coup, which is different. But it was Red Cloud's influence that largely, as I said earlier, and Sterling alluded to, shaped the way in which this whole campaign against for Kearny and the other two forts was carried out. It was not an easy thing for Red Cloud to do. I mean, the kind of leadership hierarchy that existed in those days was one of influence, not authority, as was in the Army. In the Army, under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, and a commander in the field, in some cases, can order a death penalty for somebody who doesn't follow orders. Not so among us. A leader was a leader because of the kind of decisions he made, the kind of a person he was as far as character, morality, and all of those factors. And Red Cloud certainly had all of those going for him, and because of those factors, he was able to convince others how to conduct this campaign. My name is Joe Marshall. I am a Sioux Lakota. I know that probably doesn't mean anything to you. The contemporary name for my tribe is Rosebud Sioux. I was born and raised on the Rosebud Sioux Reservation in South Dakota. What I'm about to talk to you about is Indian weaponry, and I learned about that from a couple of grandfathers. One of my grandfathers was a man who enjoyed making bows and arrows, and the only thing he enjoyed more was shooting them. By the 1860s, a lot of the Lakota had traded for various kinds of firearms, and the most prevalent kind, most common kind, was the single-shot muzzleloader. This is an example of that kind of a weapon, and this is an example of the kind of decoration that was done to weapons of this kind. All the firearms that Indians had at that point here in this area did not look like this. There was no commissary that they went to and drew their weapons. They traded for them through various calibers and various brands. Some of them were made in Kentucky, some of them elsewhere in the United States, and eventually ended up here. Some of them were made primarily for trade with the Indians. And those trade rifles were not very good. So you can see someone probably had a vested interest in making a rifle that was not quite as good if they knew it was going to be fired back at them. But most of them had this basic appearance. Some were decorated, a lot of them, as a matter of fact, were decorated with brass buttons and so forth. This is a single shot 54 caliber muzzle loader. And as you can see, the front sight has been sawed down. There's a single action, you pull the bolt back or pull the hammer back and squeeze the trigger. And that's how it works. I have a muzzle loader that I haven't shot yet, but people who have tell me that it takes a long time from one shot to the next to fire again, maybe 30, 35, 40 seconds, depending on how proficient you are. And Indian warriors, some of them were known to reload from the back of a galloping horse, pouring the powder in the palm of their hand over a lead ball, guessing that the amount of powder was right. And if it wasn't enough, then of course the lead ball didn't fly very far. If it was too much, then it went too far, maybe even knocked the rider off his horse. That's been known to happen. But there are paintings and stories of warriors spitting the lead balls down the barrel. Can't happen because the ball needs a patch to make it fit, and it has to be rammed down the barrel with this ramrod. So that's just a fanciful depiction of Indian warriors with their mouths up to the muzzle of the gun. You try it. Don't take my word for it. You try it. Because once with that patch, that lead ball fits snugly in here and has to be pounded down. This is a similar weapon. It's made out of brass. There's something slightly different about this one. If you look real close, you can see. There's a pipe bowl right here. You put tobacco in it, you light it, and you smoke it from this end. So if you feel like being friendly, then you use this side. If you don't feel like being too friendly, then you use this side. Now you've heard the expression, bury the hatchet. Well, this is a trade item. This was manufactured specifically for trade with the Indians. And traders along the East Coast and the eastern woodlands would, to signify that they were there to trade, would bury the head of this hatchet in the ground, as a sign to the Indians that they were trading rather than fighting. So that's what when a male child, was about 4 or 5 years old, even before he was 4 or 5, as a matter of fact, a toy bull, like this big, was hung in his cradle bowl. And as he was growing up, there was a bull and other kinds of weapons, replicas, miniatures, in his proximity, so he could reach and touch them and play with them and become familiar with the feel of them, but especially this particular weapon. Because this was the weapon that defined the hunter as well as the warrior. This was the weapon that enabled the hunter to provide for his family. This was the weapon that enabled the warrior, the same hunter as a fighting man, to protect and defend his family and his home and his community. That's all it is. It's a stick with a string. But it can do a lot of damage in the right hands. Not counting my brothers-in-law, of course. You have to understand that they couldn't hit the broadside of a barn from inside the barn. This particular bow is made out of Osage orange, which is not native to this country. Osage orange is probably the hardest wood in North America, and it's found. Bows were made from hardwood. Just about any kind of hardwood can be made into a bow. Up in this part of the country, it's ash, chokecherry, and oak. Those were the preferred woods in ash, chokecherry, and oak.